somewhat conveniently, Mark's Gospel falls into 4 lots of 4 chapters. And although the sections don't quite run with our chapter numbers, so it's not quite 1 to 4 and 5 to 8, it is around that, and it helps you get an inner sense of where we are in Mark's narrative. So the first section of Mark's Gospel is the introductory section. And if you read your way through the introductory section, then you realise that you get sample features of Jesus' ministry. So you get a key miracle, you get a key piece of teaching, you get a key piece of controversy, and so on. So if you have a look at the first 4 chapters, Mark gives you one of each of the features of Jesus' life, so that you get a sense of what you're going to look forward to for the rest of the Gospel. So Mark basically introduces you to the themes that you're going to encounter in the rest of the Gospel in the first 4 chapters. He then begins to focus on particular themes. So right at the end of the first section in chapter 4, we have a discussion between Jesus and the disciples about parables and who understands and how they understand. And one of the key features that Jesus says in chapter 4 is that to you, meaning the disciples, shall be revealed the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. So what you have therefore is the expectation is the disciples are going to understand who Jesus is in a way that the other hearers of Jesus do not. So the next section of Mark's Gospel is a section in which discipleship is explored, where you have some key encounters between Jesus and his disciples, and then between Jesus and other people. And as they have these key encounters, you begin to engage with something of the nature of discipleship, what Jesus expects of his disciples. This is something that I'm going to talk about again later on, but we'll just notice it for the moment, that actually you have this discipleship section, which is characterised by how you respond to Jesus and how you learn. It's worth just reminding ourselves at this particular point that the word disciple doesn't mean a follower of Jesus, as often people assume that it means, but the word disciple means a learner. The Greek word mathetes is simply somebody who learns, and that is taken over into the Latin word discipulus, from which we get our word disciple. So a disciple is somebody who learns from Jesus. They become a follower because that's how you do your learning, but actually the disciple doesn't mean follower, it means somebody who learns. So those chapters of Mark's Gospel, 4 to 8, are reflections on how you learn who Jesus is. Which brings you into the third section of Mark's Gospel, in which Jesus is turning his attention to the cross. And so you have, therefore, in 4 to 8, what does it mean to be a learner from Jesus? And then in the next section, you have, therefore, the expectations. If you are going to learn from Jesus, what is this going to mean? It is going to mean that you follow Jesus all the way to the cross. So the third section of Mark's Gospel is what you might call the shadow of the cross, where you are looking forwards to the big moment of Jesus' life, of his own crucifixion, but in the recognition that actually that requires us as disciples to follow him to the crucifixion. And then the fourth section is Jesus' death and resurrection, in which Mark reaches his climax of the gospel, and you understand something about who Jesus is because of his death and resurrection. And so therefore you have this building narrative all the way through to the death and resurrection. Jesus dies, you have the big moment of recognition by the centurion, and then we move onwards into the resurrection where the women are told to go and proclaim now who Jesus is. So you can see that actually therefore Mark's Gospel is structured very carefully to lead you in your responding to Jesus. We have an introduction to who he is, then we have an extended reflection about what discipleship is, then you have a reflection on what the consequences of discipleship are following Jesus to the cross, and then you see Jesus going to the cross with his death and resurrection. And it is quite helpful whenever you are reading Mark's Gospel to remember whichever bit of Mark, remember where it is and where it comes in the overarching sweep. Because by and large, Mark is trying to push you towards the understanding of this sweep of the Gospel. So to hold that simple fourfold structure in your mind can often help you to understand what Mark is trying to imply by the particular narrative that he's telling at any one moment. One of the key themes of Mark's Gospel is discipleship and how you respond to Jesus. And it's worth us at this point stopping and having a look at Mark's reflection on the nature of discipleship as it features in chapters 4 to 8, because that's the section of the Gospel where you have discipleship referred to particularly. And it is almost at that point as though Mark is doing an extended reflection on what does it mean to be a disciple? What does Jesus expect from his disciples? And consequently, we need to go back into the end bit of chapter 4 in order to be able to set up and understand precisely what's going on. So you have a conversation between Jesus and his disciples in chapter 4 about the parable of the sower. And you have that element of them not really understanding what Jesus is talking about. And then Jesus, at the end of that section, we have Mark referring to, with many such parables he spoke to them, as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. So we're teed up at that point for the next bit of the narrative, because we know that the outsiders are not going to understand Jesus, but it's all right because he's going to explain everything in private to the disciples. They will comprehend, all will be well, and we can therefore understand how the narrative unfolds. Once you get into the heart of chapters 4 to 8, however, you realise that something really strikingly different is going on. Jesus may be explaining everything in private to the disciples. It doesn't mean they're understanding. And if we remind ourselves that the name disciple means someone who learns, you then get into Mark's reflection about what a disciple is. Are you someone who is actually learning? It seems to me that what's going on in Mark's Gospel is the disciples are hearing all sorts of things, but they're not learning. And this comes to a high point in 3 particular points in Mark's Gospel, particularly in these 4 chapters of 4 to 8. Because in these 4 chapters, you have 3 boat scenes. And very strikingly, you have a boat scene in chapter 4, one in chapter 6, and one in chapter 8. So this second section of Mark's Gospel is punctuated with boat scenes, one at the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end. And in each of the boat scenes, you have an encounter between Jesus and the disciples. Almost, have you understood yet? Are you there? Have you comprehended? So our first boat scene is the stilling of the storm in Mark 4 verses 35 to 41, when the disciples are terribly afraid and they have this conversation with Jesus. And interestingly enough, Jesus comments to the disciples. In most of our English translations, it comes across as, "Why are you so afraid?" Which to the modern reader seems an odd question to ask, because they've just been nearly drowned in a storm. We can work out without too much difficulty why it is that they were so afraid. But actually, that probably isn't the best translation of the Greek at that point, because Jesus asks them not, "Why are you phobos," which is the normal word for being afraid, but "Why are you deilos?" And the word deilos means timid, likely to be afraid. Why are you the kinds of people who are always being afraid? And that therefore gets you into